They never told you that a king's truest secrets were hidden not in war rooms, but in the grease that glistened on his fingers. Behind every polished feast lurked a shadow meal, one that revealed fear, desire, weakness, and hunger no throne could erase. Each bite carried a confession history refused to write. Tonight, you will walk into those kitchens and taste the truths the Tudors tried to bury. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one imagined the Tudor court solely through its ceremonies, one might believe that kings fed themselves on nothing but spectacle. Yet the truth, as always, lived in the quiet corners. Those moments when the gold thread curtains fell shut, when the servants drifted out of sight, and when the king finally sat not as a sovereign but as a man, hungry and unguarded. Public feasting was a performance, a ritual crafted to reassure the kingdom that strength was abundant, wealth unshakable, and authority absolute. Silver platters gleamed beneath candlelight. Musicians played until their fingers stiffened, and courtiers watched each gesture of the monarch as if a misplaced glance could alter their fates. But the performance told only half the story. It was never meant to reveal appetite, it was meant to conceal it. Behind those same walls, in the hours when ceremonies dissolved into silence, the king's relationship with food changed in ways few dared imagine. The royal body was a national symbol, disciplined, refined, tempered by divine duty. Yet no symbol can survive hunger untouched. And hunger has always been honest. In private, the king reached not for the sculpted dishes displayed during celebrations, but for the things that comforted him, soothed him, or reminded him, painfully, tenderly, of a self unburdened by the weight of the crown, a roast torn by hand, a slice of coarse bread still warm from the hearth, to a cup of ale stronger than any court physician allowed. These were the gestures of a man reclaiming something that the throne had taken from him. But the secrecy surrounding these meals was not accidental. Food, in the Tudor imagination, held moral, spiritual, and political weight. A monarch who appeared indulgent risked the judgment of nobles already waiting for signs of weakness. A monarch who appeared restrained risked accusations of being bloodless, fragile, or ascetic. Every bite in public spoke loudly and without compassion. So the king learned to hide the bites that mattered most. He learned to fold desire into shadows, to dismiss servants at carefully chosen moments, to savor what the realm must never see. The world beyond the palace gates believed in the illusion that kings dined only on dignity. But illusions were part of governance, and governance rarely left room for truth. Even within the palace, whispers circulated about these hidden meals. A chamberlain who carried away a tray too quickly. A cook who noticed a preference for offcuts rather than the ornate centerpieces. A guard who overheard unexpected requests late at night. Each witness carried a fragment of a reality never recorded in state papers, yet none spoke openly. Silence was its own currency in the Tudor world, traded and protected, with the kind of loyalty that came not from affection but from fear. What the king ate in private was as guarded as what he confessed, or whom he trusted, or what kept him awake in the unsteady hours before dawn. These secret meals also revealed something more unsettling, that even absolute power could not protect the monarch from the simplest, most human craving: to be unobserved, to eat without performance, to chew without symbolism, to taste without consequence. In a world where every gesture was watched, interpreted, polished, or condemned, the act of eating alone became a form of rebellion. The king's table in public was a stage. His table in private was a refuge. And like all refuges, it was fragile. The moment a servant re-entered, the moment a knock echoed against the wooden door, the sovereign returned instantly, swallowing whatever softness had dared to appear. If one stood in the corridor outside the king's private chambers, the contrast between the two worlds would be almost grotesque. Beyond one door lay the great hall, with its banners, trumpets, and the orchestrated clatter of knives against pewter. Beyond another door lay a smaller room, warm, dim, almost intimate, where a single plate might rest crookedly on a linen cloth, and where the king's fingers, still smelling faintly of ink from the day's decrees, might tear a piece of meat without ceremony. To the realm, he was the embodiment of order. To himself, at least for a moment, he was simply a man discovering what hunger meant when no one else required him to perform. This tension between the crown and the body was the essence of Tudor dining. It shaped the way kings behaved, the way servants tiptoed, and the way rumours spread across the court. And though no official record described these hidden meals, small traces lingered. A servant's nervous testimony, a chronicler's ambiguous line, a stain on a tunic that court etiquette insisted could not exist. These fragments, fragile and easily dismissed, to reveal something more piercing than any formal account of royal banquets. They show the king in the one arena where he could not command truth to bend. Appetite remains stubbornly real, even for those who live in the land of symbols. To imagine these quiet meals is to understand the Tudor court more deeply than any grand feast could allow. Power can be staged, hunger cannot, and in those unguarded bites, the ones taken in shadow, away from the courtier's hungry eyes, there flickered glimpses of the monarch's true nature: insecurity, longing, loneliness, indulgence, fear, or simply the desire to control one thing in a world where control was never complete. History adores spectacle, but the soul of a kingdom is often found in its smallest rituals, performed in silence. In truth, the secret feasts of the Tudors tell a softer story than the grand banquets written into chronicles. Yet those faint traces point toward deeper hungers the court never admitted aloud. And somewhere beyond the guarded quiet lay another revelation waiting to disturb the polished surface. Public dining in the Tudor court was never truly about food. It was a spectacle crafted with precision, a theatre in which every gesture from the king's hand and every glimmer of a polished platter carried a message far heavier than the meal itself. The dishes paraded through the great hall were symbols, carefully arranged proofs that power was abundant, stability secure, and hierarchy unquestioned. For the nobles watching from below the dais, the king's table was not a place of nourishment, but an altar of authority. What the monarch consumed mattered far less than how he appeared to consume it. And so the ritual took on a life of its own, a choreography meant to display absolute control, in a world where control was always under threat. Servants moved with an almost ceremonial stillness, their steps rehearsed, their hands steady even under the weight of platters layered with meats sculpted into unnatural perfection. The procession signaled order, hierarchy, obedience. Nothing about it suggested spontaneity or appetite. A misplaced crumb, a tremor in the hand, a spill on the floor. Any of these could break the illusion, and illusions were essential. The kingdom needed to believe that its ruler possessed not only strength, but refinement, that he could rise above earthly cravings and display a composure untouched by hunger. Even the act of raising a cup became deliberate, performed slowly enough for every pair of watching eyes to absorb the message hidden within the movement. The menu itself was curated as meticulously as a royal decree. Each dish served in public had been chosen not because the king desired it, but because it communicated something about wealth, dominion, or sophistication. Exotic spices hinted at far-reaching influence. Massive roasts suggested unmatched resources. Perfectly carved portions displayed the unseen labour of dozens who existed solely to uphold the monarch's image. The king might not enjoy half the foods placed before him. Yet he was expected to maintain the facade of pleasure, to grimace, to hesitate. Even to eat too eagerly risked signalling vulnerability. His appetite belonged to the kingdom, and so it became a political instrument shaped by expectation rather than desire. The courtiers understood this dynamic intimately. They watched the king's plate as much as his face, searching for meaning in every detail. If he ignored a particular dish, whispers followed. If he tasted another with visible enthusiasm, alliances shifted. A monarch's public meal was therefore not a simple event, but a negotiation, one in which nobles gauged favour and danger with every swallow and pause. The king's silence, too, carried weight. A refusal to speak could be read as displeasure, while a short laugh over a cup of wine might be interpreted as forgiveness. Few moments in court life offered so many opportunities for misinterpretation, and yet the ritual persisted because it reinforced the distance between ruler and ruled. The king sat elevated, illuminated by candlelight, while the rest of the hall drowned in shadow. Beneath this elaborate display lay an uncomfortable truth. The Tudor monarchy depended on the belief that its ruler was superior in every way. Even in the mundane act of eating, the table became an emblem of divinely sanctioned authority. To sit at it, even for a moment, was to borrow the aura of kingship. To serve it was to reinforce the world's natural order. Every plate, knife, and goblet contributed to the choreography of dominance. And because the meal functioned as a performance, spontaneity could never enter the room. Appetite was rehearsed. Satisfaction was mimed. Even fullness was political. Too little suggested frailty. Too much hinted at indulgence. The kitchen staff understood the stakes as acutely as the courtiers did. They worked not merely to prepare food, but to sculpt power into edible form. The roasts had to glisten just so. The pies needed to slice cleanly without crumbling. The colours had to appear vibrant beneath candlelight. Failure was more than a culinary error. It was a threat to the king's image. The great hall was a battlefield fought with polished cutlery rather than swords. And cooks, carvers, servers, and tasters all played their part in protecting the sovereign from embarrassment or suspicion. Even poison, the fear of every royal household, shaped the ritual. Dishes were tested, tasted, inspected, and presented with an almost sacred stiffness. Observers from foreign courts often described the precision of Tudor dining with a mixture of admiration and unease. They sensed the tension beneath the surface, the way each course moved like a piece in a political game. Some claimed the king appeared more like a statue than a man, posed, still, immutable in his performance. But that was the point. The monarch could not betray emotion, hunger, or uncertainty. His role required composure beyond any natural human capacity, a restraint cultivated through years of expectation. The table was simply another stage upon which he proved that he was not merely a man but the body of the kingdom itself. Yet beneath the grandeur, cracks inevitably formed. A flicker of impatience when a dish arrived late, a fleeting grimace at a flavour prepared for symbolism rather than taste, a momentary stiffness in the king's shoulders as the watching eyes pressed into him like silent weights. Anyone close enough could sense the tension, though few dared acknowledge it. The ritual was too deeply woven into the fabric of power. Even discomfort had to be performed gracefully. The spectacle of Tudor dining revealed more about authority than the dishes themselves ever could. Yet beneath its polished choreography, faint tremors hinted at desires unspoken and truths carefully hidden. And somewhere beyond that gleaming hall waited a quieter table where the king's mask finally slipped. The silence that followed the end of a Tudor banquet was often more revealing than the feast itself. Once the musicians stopped, once the courtiers bowed their way out of the hall, once the shimmering trays had been carried off stage, something in the air loosened. Just enough for the king to breathe as a man rather than a monument. The weight of ceremony fell away with surprising speed, and in its absence lay a smaller, dimmer world where appetite no longer needed to obey ritual. Here, in these narrow rooms, tucked behind tapestried corridors or hidden above the kitchens, the king confronted the simplest truth of all, that hunger is an intimate act, one that loses its meaning when performed for an audience. These private meals rarely resembled the displays that court chroniclers described with such reverence. Gone were the sculpted roasts meant to proclaim dominion, the elaborate pastries shaped to flatter foreign envoys, the spices acquired at costs too high to confess. What remained instead were dishes that belonged to a different life entirely, a life the king might have tasted before the crown settled on his head like a shackle. A bowl of broth still steaming, a piece of coarse bread torn rather than sliced, leftovers from the kitchens that carried the honest scent of salt and smoke rather than saffron and ceremony. Food uncomplicated, food without symbolism. Food was chosen because the king, for reasons he could not always articulate, wanted it. In these narrow spaces, the presence of trusted companions changed the nature of the meal as well. Most kings ate alone, but occasionally a confidant, one who had survived enough storms to earn the right to silence, was permitted to sit nearby. Words did not travel easily in such moments. Conversations came slowly, as though careful not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. A shared glance, a small nod, a weary sigh did more to reveal the monarch's inner state than any formal proclamation issued from the throne. Here, the king might admit, without speaking, that the crown was heavier than the world believed. He might chew more slowly, letting the warmth of the meal settle his nerves, reminding him that he was not merely a symbol, but a creature of blood and frailty. The servants who witnessed these moments learned quickly to avert their eyes. They carried trays with a reverence bordering on fear, aware that what they saw would never be repeated beyond the room. The king's posture softened, his jaw unclenched. His gestures lost the rigid choreography that defined his public existence. There were even times when he set aside the knife and carved meat with his hands. Not out of savagery, but out of a desire to feel something. Anything that belonged to him alone. Such gestures were dangerous in their honesty, for they belonged to a world not meant to exist within palace walls. What made these private meals so unsettling was not their simplicity, but their vulnerability. A monarch who ate in solitude revealed a truth no court wished to acknowledge, that absolute power could not erase loneliness. The great hall offered noise, spectacle, flattery, and fear. This small chamber offered only the sound of chewing, the faint crackle of the hearth, and the king's own thoughts. Thoughts he often worked desperately to silence. Appetite, like grief or doubt, arrived without permission. And in those unguarded minutes, the king confronted versions of himself that the realm was never meant to see. Some kings found comfort in these quiet rituals, others feared them. To sit alone at a table with a plate of unadorned food was to admit, even briefly, that grandeur could not disguise emptiness. The crown demanded distance, yet distance hollowed the man who wore it. The simplicity of these meals, these ordinary dishes so far removed from the language of court politics, cut closer to the bone than any dagger. They reminded the monarch of childhood kitchens, of scents that belonged to mothers rather than mistresses, of evenings when life had been shaped by small choices rather than the expectations of a kingdom. A private meal also stripped away the protection of spectacle. In public, courtiers saw only what they were meant to see. In private, even hunger became a confession. When the king reached eagerly for a dish, it suggested need. When he pushed food aside, it suggested fear or illness. Trusted servants learned to read these signs like scripture. They knew when the king was weary of war long before proclamations were written, when he doubted his counsel long before decisions were made, when he mourned, when he resented, when he longed. Appetite spoke a language far more honest than politics. But honesty was perilous in a world that fed on secrecy. A king who allowed himself to be human risked remembering too clearly what humanity cost. The more he tasted simplicity, the more alarming his public feasts became. Performances layered with false smiles, forced gestures, and the unspoken dread that the kingdom expected not a man, but a monument carved from divine intention. Each private meal created a contrast sharp enough to become dangerous. Truth could not exist beside duty without tension. And in these quiet chambers, the tension thickened like mist. What lingered most in these private feasts was the awareness that they could be taken away without warning. A knock on the door, a crisis in the council chamber, a whisper of betrayal. Any of these could force the king back into the role he wore like armor. The last bite often tasted of resignation. The last swallow of wine carried the weight of returning to a world where walls listened and eyes judged. Yet for a moment, however brief, these meals granted the king a narrow refuge, carved from silence and steam. In these hidden rooms, the king's appetite finally spoke with a voice unbound by ceremony, revealing fears and desires the court would never dare imagine. And still, the faint tremor of those private truths pointed toward deeper currents, stirring beyond the edge of candlelight. Hints of something waiting to shift the ground beneath him. Somewhere past that fragile quiet, a far more consuming hunger was preparing to step into view. Henry VIII's appetite occupied a realm all its own. Vast, unruly, and indifferent to the warnings murmured by physicians or the quiet dread of those who served him. Publicly, his meals were displays of royal grandeur, orchestrated with the same precision as a coronation. But in private, his hunger swelled beyond spectacle, becoming something heavier, more demanding, almost predatory. He did not crave delicate cuts, arranged into pleasing shapes or dishes engineered for elegance. He craved mass, weight, the feeling of tearing through something substantial enough to remind him he was still alive, still powerful, still unchallenged even by his own body. Those who watched him during these private feasts understood the shift instantly. The king who performed dignity in the great hall transformed into a figure ruled by appetite. Not ritual. Platters arrived not in carefully carved portions, but as whole limbs, whole birds, whole slabs of flesh that glistened beneath firelight. A roasted chicken, still steaming, an entire shank of pork salted to the bone, sausages so heavily spiced they stung the eyes of the servants who carried them in. These were not foods meant for graceful dining. They were meant to be handled, torn, and conquered, and Henry preferred them precisely for that reason. He ate with a focus that bordered on violence, not chaotic, but deeply deliberate, as though devouring these enormous portions allowed him to consume something intangible: fear, frustration, loneliness, the ceaseless anxiety of rule. His fingertips grew slick with fat, his jaw worked with relentless purpose, his eyes sharpened, fixed not on the room nor the people in it, but on the meal before him, as though each bite carved out a moment of control he could not find elsewhere. Power on the battlefield required armies. Power in council needed persuasion. But power at the table belonged entirely to him. No noble could challenge a king in the privacy of his hunger. The kitchen staff knew his preferences intimately. They learned to anticipate his cravings long before he voiced them. If a day in court grew particularly tense, they prepared dishes with more salt, more fat, more heat, foods that grounded him, steadied him, or at least distracted him long enough to forget how many eyes waited for him to slip. They roasted meats until the skin crackled, stuffed sausages with pepper, so sharp it made lesser men cough, and salted pork legs until the flesh blushed deep pink beneath the blade. Servants carried these dishes into his chambers with their heads bowed low, praying silently that the flavors would satisfy him. A disappointed king was a danger no one wished to face. There was a peculiar comfort Henry found in the weight of these foods. As his body grew larger, as his legs struggled beneath him, as ulcers and injuries carved new vulnerabilities into his flesh, he clung even more fiercely to the meals that mirrored his own physical magnitude. His size became both his armor and his prison. A symbol of dominance and a reminder of decline. Eating became a declaration he was still here, still forceful, still king. Each oversized portion felt like a refusal to be diminished by illness or age. Yet the irony was sharp enough to taste. His appetite strengthened the very weaknesses he sought to deny. In these private moments, the distance between Henry the monarch and Henry the man collapsed. The king who demanded obedience, who reshaped religion, and who dismantled marriages with a signature, revealed something surprisingly fragile at the table. His hunger was not merely physical, it carried the weight of insecurity, the fear of losing strength, the fear of losing relevance, the fear of being seen as anything less than the unyielding figure he projected to the world. The more he lost control of his body, the more desperately he tried to assert control over his meals. The platter became a battleground where he could still dominate, still decide, still win. There were evenings when the appetite was quieter, gentler even, but these moments dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Most nights, the king consumed his food with a force that left the room thick with heat and silence. Servants standing by the walls grew accustomed to the sound, the tearing of roasted flesh, the heavy breathing between bites, the low hum of satisfaction when he found the exact texture he craved. These noises never appeared in court records, yet they revealed more about Henry than any treaty or proclamation. Appetite speaks honestly. It does not flatter. It does not negotiate. And it does not lie. The truth was unavoidable. Henry VIII sought refuge in the abundance he demanded. The more his world fractured, alliances shifting, wives replaced, rebellions simmering, the more fiercely he clung to these visceral pleasures. A king who ruled with thunder in public often soothed himself with fat, salt, spice, and heat in private. The meals were excessive, reckless even, but they gave him a fleeting sense of invincibility. And invincibility, however brief, was something he could not resist. Henry's appetite revealed a force deeper than indulgence, a hunger that fed on dominance and denial as much as on meat and spice. And beneath that roaring desire, quieter shadows hinted at cravings he never intended the court to witness, leaving another truth waiting to surface beyond the reach of candlelight. Night in the Tudor palace carried a silence unlike any other. Thick, heavy, and pulsing with secrets. Most of the court slept behind carved wooden doors, their dreams softened by exhaustion and routine. But in the king's chambers, the hours after midnight often stirred with a different kind of waking. Hunger, restless and insistent, rose in the dark like a whispered summons. It was during these hours that the king asked for what no physician approved of, what no council would dare acknowledge, and what only the smallest circle of servants knew how to deliver without leaving a trace. Midnight transformed appetite into something dangerous, something that lived outside the rules. Daylight demanded he obey. The royal physicians had long warned him against these nocturnal indulgences. They wrote their advice with trembling hands, masking fear beneath elaborate medical reasoning. Fatigue worsened digestion, heavy food suffocated the humours, strong drink clouded judgment. They spoke as though their words could ward off consequences. But the king listened only with the surface of his mind. Deep beneath that layer, where pride and desire sat coiled together, he heard something else, the thrill of defiance. Midnight food tasted better because it was forbidden. Spiced meats, hot wine, salted pastries. None of these belonged to the quiet domain of sleep. They belonged to appetite unleashed, desire unmasked, authority reaffirmed. His requests were never loud. A gesture, to a glance, a single word spoken in a tone that allowed no hesitation. Servants knew the ritual by heart. They moved through corridors lit faintly by torches that hissed against stone, careful not to let their footsteps echo. To be summoned for a midnight meal meant stepping into a world where the king was stripped of ceremony but not of power. They carried trays wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, their palms damp with the knowledge that no mistake would be tolerated. Midnight magnified consequences. Even the air felt watchful. Inside the chamber, candlelight bent gently across the king's figure, casting long shadows that trembled with each flicker. He waited in a posture too alert to be restful. The bed stood untouched, the hearth burned low. These were the hours when the kingdom was quiet enough for him to feel the edges of his solitude. Hunger arrived, not only in his stomach, but in his chest, his throat, the hollows of memory he could not suppress. Food became a companion when loyalty wavered, and alliance thinned. Strong drink became armor, heavy and numbing, granting him a temporary shelter from the politics that gnawed at him with sharper teeth than any roast he tore apart. The dishes he requested at night differed from those of daytime feasts. They carried the scent of comfort rather than triumph. A trencher of roasted fowl, skin still crisp, a pot of spiced wine warmed until it trembled beneath its lid, slices of salted pork glistening with fat that softened in the heat of the room. He consumed them slowly or furiously, depending on the shape of his mood. Sometimes he ate in silence, the room echoing only with the faint scrape of meat, leaving bone. Other nights, he drank deeply, his breathing growing louder, his shoulders settling as though the weight of the crown eased for a moment. To an outsider, these meals might seem indulgent. To the king, they were declarations, proof that he could bend the night to his will, that the body others hoped to regulate still belonged to him alone. Midnight offered a strange kind of freedom. In the absence of watching eyes, he could reclaim an intimacy with hunger that public ritual stole from him, breaking the physician's rules, ignoring the limits of his health, summoning servants long after the palace had settled. Each of these gestures affirmed that even vulnerability could be shaped into power. The servants felt the tension in the room like a second temperature. They watched the way he held his cup, the way his jaw tightened after each swallow, the way his gaze drifted toward the window, as though searching the darkness for something he could not name. They served quickly, discreetly, and never spoke unless commanded. They knew these hours revealed a side of the king the court would not recognize. A man driven not by statecraft, but by longing, frustration, and the unrelenting need to feel in control of something, even if that something was merely a forbidden meal consumed in secrecy. It was impossible to ignore the danger in these habits. His body paid for them. Pain sharpened in his legs. Sluggishness crept into his mornings. Irritation flared more quickly, and physicians recorded symptoms with mounting dread. But the king did not relent. Midnight meals were no longer indulgences. They were rituals. They marked the fragile line between authority projected and authority felt. In the dark, away from the world that demanded perfection, he fed the parts of himself that daylight forced him to bury. These forbidden meals revealed a hunger sharpened by solitude, the kind that thrived in shadows where no counsel could intrude. Even so, the quiet rebellion of those midnight hours pointed toward tensions the court was never meant to witness. Murmurs rising just beyond the reach of candlelight. Somewhere within that growing unrest, another layer of appetite waited to expose itself. There were rare moments in the Tudor court when the king allowed his body to speak louder than his crown. Moments when the performance of power fell away, and instinct stepped in to claim what ritual tried so hard to suppress. These moments did not happen in the Great Hall or before watching courtiers. They emerged in the private folds of the palace, behind shuttered doors, beside a dying fire, or in a quiet chamber where the only witness was a servant too frightened to breathe too loudly. Here, stripped of ceremony, the king revealed a truth the court was never meant to see, that hunger, when unobserved, could be both primitive and strangely liberating. Without the burden of etiquette, the king reached for food, with a physical immediacy that shocked those who saw it. He did not cut meat into neat slices or pretend delicacy he did not feel. He tore into it. He let grease coat his fingers, knowing he did not need to hide the shine of fat or the drip that ran down his hand before he wiped it away against a cloth. Bones cracked with soft, deliberate pressure, skin split beneath the weight of his grip. What in public would be condemned as crude became, in private, an intimate assertion of freedom for a man caged by expectations. The absence of table manners felt like a breath of air after years underwater. The foods he craved in these unguarded hours reflected this shift. He preferred dishes that resisted refinement. Sticky, heavy, unashamedly messy. A slab of roast glistening with fat, a dripping joint of mutton, fingers burned slightly by hot grease before finding their rhythm in tearing the meat apart. He wanted texture, weight, resistance. These foods did not require a courtly explanation or a carefully arranged plate. They allowed him to forget, if only for a few minutes, that the world expected elegance from someone who rarely felt elegant inside his own skin. Servants who observed these transformations carried the memory like a brand. They were trained to remain expressionless, to lower their eyes, to pretend they saw only what they were meant to see. But even trained eyes could not ignore the intensity of the king's demeanor. There was no mistaking the shift. The straightened spine melting into a looser, heavier posture, the jaw unclenching, the breath deepening as he abandoned control. The sound of teeth tearing through roasted flesh, the slow sucking of marrow from bone, the satisfied exhale that followed each bite. None of these belonged to the king who appeared in council chambers. They belonged to the man buried beneath layers of responsibility and fear. The king did not apologize for these moments. He did not slow himself or pretend restraint. The absence of witnesses made an apology unnecessary. In truth, the rawness of the act seemed to soothe him in a way no doctor's tonic ever could. Hunger without an audience was honest. It carried no political consequence, no whispered interpretation, no danger of misreading. For once, the king could exist without performance. In the crude tearing of food, he reclaimed a sensation of control that had nothing to do with ruling a kingdom, and everything to do with the simple human need to feel the body's power. Of course, these indulgences came with risk. A man who ruled through image could not afford such vulnerability to be seen by the wrong eyes. The palace remained a web of listening walls and opportunistic spies. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and a single careless servant could transform a private moment into a weapon. Thus, these meals were guarded with a paranoia that bordered on ritual. Doors were bolted, curtains drawn. Only the most trusted attendants are allowed near. Even among them, silence was demanded, not through threat alone, but through the mutual understanding that seeing the king reduced to instinct was seeing him too closely. What drove him to abandon restraint so completely? Part of it was exhaustion. Mental, physical, and political. Part of it was resentment, the kind that grows quietly in a life lived under constant scrutiny. And part of it was the seductive relief that came from surrendering to the body's simplest urges. To eat like this was to forget, however briefly, the armor he wore from dawn until dusk. It was a rebellion not against his realm but against the cage of dignity that came with ruling it. In these unscripted moments, his identity blurred. The monarch dissolved. The man remained, and beneath him stirred something older. Instinct, appetite, the animal strength that royal protocol tried endlessly to tame. It did not make him monstrous. It made him painfully real. And perhaps that reality frightened him more than any court intrigue could. When dignity no longer governed his hands, the king's hunger revealed a truth far sharper than the knives he refused to use. Even so, the shadows around these private feasts hinted at emotions far heavier than appetite alone, stirring in places he could not afford to expose. From deep within that gathering unrest, another layer of secrecy prepared to open itself. Official histories of the Tudor court were curated with the same care as a royal portrait, shaped to depict only what flattered, never what revealed. Chroniclers described banquets with lyrical admiration, listing dishes that gleamed with saffron, gilded sugar, and meats carved into impossible shapes. These records created a world of polished abundance, a kingdom governed by refinement rather than need. But just beyond those elegant sentences, hidden behind the velvet curtain of royal discretion, lived another culinary truth, one the court refused to acknowledge. It was a truth built from dishes deemed too common, too visceral, too revealing of the monarch's unfiltered desires. These foods rarely appeared in writing because they lacked spectacle. They belonged not to the architecture of power, but to the private rooms where power softened into appetite. Offal, kidneys, livers, hearts, brains formed the core of these hidden meals. They were cheap for commoners, but for a king they offered something deeper, flavour unmasked by ceremony, nourishment that tasted of earth rather than empire, served hot and quickly, before their scent could drift too far. These dishes carried with them an intimacy that no public feast could match. They suggested need rather than triumph, humanity rather than grandeur. To the scribes whose quills shaped the official narrative, such meals were unthinkable. How could a king, God's chosen, the embodiment of national strength, be associated with a bowl of stewed kidneys or blood sausage thickened with grain? These foods had no place in the language of rule. They did not flatter. They did not impress foreign envoys. They did not project the image of a monarch elevated above the baseness of ordinary life. And so the ink passed over them, leaving blank spaces where truth should have been. History became a mirror, polished to reflect only what the court was willing to see. The royal cooks, however, knew the truth intimately. Their daily work involved more than preparing meals. It required navigating the delicate boundary between public performance and private craving. They learned which dishes the king would request when he felt nostalgic, which when he was angry, which when he needed comfort after a bitter council meeting. These meals, simple, steaming, pungent, became coded messages spoken in the language of the kitchen. A servant who carried a tray of fried liver into the king's chamber understood that the request came not from indulgence, but from exhaustion. A pot of spiced blood pudding signalled something different, perhaps a desire for warmth, or heaviness, or grounding in a world that shifted too frequently beneath the king's feet. Such dishes also carried risk. They revealed the monarch's vulnerabilities, cravings that contradicted the image the court worked tirelessly to uphold. For this reason, the cooks who prepared them held a perilous kind of power. They knew what the king ate when he wanted to disappear behind his own authority. They saw the plates emptied quickly, the bowls scraped clean, the evidence of hunger too real to fit into the polished narrative of sovereignty. And they understood, better than any chronicler, that these foods reflected the king's private self far more accurately than any gilded feast. But secrecy was a condition of survival. The cooks and servers swore themselves to silence, not through oaths, but through fear. Fear of dismissal, imprisonment, or something quieter and far more final. A single rumour about the king's hidden meals could be twisted into a claim of weakness or moral decay. Court politics sharpened every detail into a possible weapon, and so the truth remained trapped in the kitchens, spoken only in glances exchanged between those who carried dishes along shadowed corridors long after the rest of the palace slept. Occasionally, faint traces of these meals slipped into the margins of personal letters or the diaries of foreign observers. A remark about a strange smell drifting from a private chamber. A brief note on the king's preference for dishes too coarse to name. A servant's confession written years later, when danger no longer hovered at his door. These fragments, though small, reveal a pattern consistent enough to be undeniable. The Tudor monarchs were not sustained by spectacle alone. They craved foods that connected them to the world beneath the throne. Foods that tasted of survival rather than ceremony. To imagine a king spooning up a dish of stewed brains or biting into a still warm sausage heavy with spice is to glimpse a human being history tried to obscure. These meals stripped away pretense. They exposed a man who sought, in the thickness of broth or the iron-rich taste of organ meat, something he could not find in the perfumed dishes carried into the great hall. Appetite, when hidden, reveals longing no feast can disguise. The dishes erased from the record uncovered a truth the court preferred to forget. A truth that clung to the king far more closely than the gilded meals described by chroniclers. Even so, the quiet weight of these secret foods pointed toward deeper whispers in the kitchens, pressing against the edges of what servants dared conceal. Out of that uneasy silence, another secret began to stir. Edward VI lived in a body far more fragile than the throne he inherited. A body that narrowed the world of food into something cautious, measured, and painfully restrained. Where his father devoured meals with the weight of a man who believed appetite confirmed authority, Edward approached food with the uncertain touch of someone who understood that excess could betray him. Doctors hovered endlessly at his side, their warnings dripping into every chamber of the palace. Eat lightly. Avoid heaviness. Shun anything that might inflame the delicate machinery of his stomach. And so the king, barely past childhood, grew accustomed to a life where nourishment felt like negotiation. His meals were small, almost monastic. Broths, thin porridges, soft breads that dissolved rather than resisted. Meat appeared rarely, and when it did, he approached it like a student examining a problem rather than a monarch taking his due. But it was sweetness, carefully chosen, modestly portioned, that stirred something warmer beneath his restraint. Almond cakes, pressed gently into shape and scented with rosewater. Plum preserves, dark and thick, served in spoonfuls no larger than a fingernail. Pear syrup, pale and translucent, sipped as though each drop carried a memory he could not name aloud. These were not indulgences in the way his father understood them. They were solace. The sweetness soothed him. It softened the sting of constant scrutiny, the exhaustion of council meetings, where men older than his tutors spoke as though he were a cipher rather than a sovereign. It softened, too, the ache of his body, a body that never allowed him to forget its limitations. In those rare minutes of quiet, when a servant slipped a small plate of sugared almonds beside him, he felt something close to peace. Not joy exactly, but a quiet relief that demanded nothing from him except to hold, to taste, to breathe. Yet sweetness held another function, one not mentioned in the physician's notes or the cook's ledgers. It became his refuge during moments of tension, moments that arrived with unsettling regularity. When debates in council turned sharp, when ambassadors pressed their demands too forcefully, when letters arrived bearing news of unrest far beyond London, he withdrew, not dramatically, not with the theatrical gestures of kings in earlier generations. He simply stepped away, slipping into a smaller chamber, closing a door, and requesting, almost whispering, a dish of something sweet. This desire did not resemble gluttony. It resembled self-preservation. Eating alone allowed him to disappear from the posture of monarchy, to shed the rigidity expected of a ruler who barely understood the world he was meant to command. In solitude, he ate slowly, letting each bite rest on his tongue as though memorizing the taste might hold the world steady for a moment longer. There was a tenderness to the act, a sense that sweetness offered him the gentleness he could not ask for openly. The servants who carried these treats knew to keep their eyes lowered. They understood the unspoken agreement. The king's sweetness was not to be discussed, not even in whispers, unlike Henry VIII's private hungers. Loud, messy, impossible to hide, Edward's cravings were delicate, almost shy. To reveal them would be to reveal his fragility. A truth the court circled but never confronted. They called him scholarly, devout, disciplined, but rarely did they acknowledge the fear threaded through his daily existence. The fear of failing a kingdom that had shaped him faster than his body could keep pace. Historians would later describe Edward as reserved, restrained, and almost ascetic. But restraint is rarely natural in someone so young. It is learned, it is imposed, and behind that imposed discipline lived the quiet rebellion of sweetness. The one pleasure he allowed himself without apology. His private chambers carried the faint scent of almond and pear, not because he indulged excessively, but because he indulged consistently, quietly, and determinedly. Something is unsettling in imagining the king seated alone, shoulders drawn inward, a single candle casting long shadows across his thin frame as he lifts a small piece of almond cake to his mouth. The palace outside continues its restless machinery. Guards exchanging watch, ministers sharpening arguments, clerks drafting proclamations under flickering lanterns, while he sits in stillness, tasting something soft enough not to trouble his stomach and sweet enough to remind him that his life was not entirely a burden. These moments did not find their way into the chronicles. Sweetness, after all, lacks the grandeur of royal feasts or the drama of political conflict. But in the gaps between official records, in the silences carefully preserved by loyal attendants, a different portrait emerges. A king who sought comfort not from power, but from the smallest, gentlest flavors. A king who never fully escaped the childhood that illness refused to let him outgrow. A king whose appetite revealed more truth than the speeches written in his name. His fragile hunger traced a quieter portrait of monarchy, one built from small indulgences rather than lavish displays. Even so, the soft pull of these secret sweets pointed toward deeper rituals, shaping the Tudor crown in ways the public never saw. From within that hidden longing, another shadowed appetite prepared to rise into view. Mary I understood better than most monarchs that a queen's meals were not merely sustenance but declarations, spoken in the language of ritual, obedience, and faith. Every Friday, every holy day, every moment marked by the Catholic calendar. Her table reflected a devotion she carried like armor. Fish dominated these meals, roasted, stewed, salted, or served cold upon silver trays. Courtiers watched her closely, reading piety into every restrained bite. To them, Mary's consumption of fish was both duty and symbol, a quiet proclamation of a queen determined to anchor her reign in the faith she believed England had betrayed. But ritual has a way of tightening around a person until even breath feels rehearsed. Beneath the veneer of solemn observance, the queen's hunger shifted. Small tremors felt only in the privacy of her chambers. Court life, thick with political tension, sharpened her anxieties. Whispers about the legitimacy of her rule, fears surrounding her marriage, the ceaseless commentary on her body and her womb. Each strain left a mark. Fish could satisfy expectation, but it could not soothe dread. And dread, when it grows heavy enough, demands a different kind of nourishment. It was in these hours, late, quiet, candlelight flickering low, that Mary's cravings slipped away from discipline and towards something far more visceral. She did not summon feasts or grand displays. She asked, instead, for meat. Warm meat, red meat, meat that contradicted the very rituals that shaped her public identity. The contradiction did not seem to trouble her. The secrecy did. A queen who performed piety before the kingdom could not be seen tearing into flesh on a night steeped in private fear. The servants who answered her calls moved carefully, understanding the delicate truth of what it meant to witness a monarch abandon ceremony. They brought small portions, never extravagant, always discreet. A slice of roasted lamb. A bit of beef is still warm, and in one account, whispered through the generations. A request so startling that even the most loyal attendant hesitated to repeat it. The queen once asked for raw mutton, trembling from exhaustion, insisting it be brought quickly before she changed her mind. Raw meat in a Tudor court was not simply a culinary preference. It was a statement of need so urgent that etiquette collapsed under its weight. Whether she ate it or merely touched it, the act revealed a woman reaching for something unmediated by ritual, something primal enough to cut through the fog of her worries. Perhaps the warmth of the meat calmed her. Perhaps the iron scent steadied her nerves. Perhaps she felt, in that forbidden moment, a flicker of strength untouched by the duties that increasingly swallowed her days. To those who served her, these contradictions were not mysteries, but truths that lived beneath the crown's polished surface. They knew that queens prayed, but queens also trembled. Queens fasted, but queens also reached for whatever might quiet the turmoil inside them. Mary's relationship with food revealed a deeper struggle than any council proclamation could articulate. The battle between the woman she had to be and the woman she could not entirely suppress. Her public meals remained perfect displays of devotion. Courtiers praised her piety. Foreign ambassadors reported on her discipline. And clergy admired her adherence to ritual. But behind these carefully curated images lived a queen whose private appetite held more honesty than her most eloquent speeches. The contrast was stark. Fish by daylight, meat by candlelight. And the tension between the two shaped a portrait far more human than the histories that later reduced her to symbols of fire and faith. It is uncomfortable to imagine Mary in these hidden hours. Her shoulders curved inward, her breath tight, a piece of forbidden meat in her hand as she tried to steady the storms inside her own mind. But these moments, stripped of ceremony, reveal the truth that ritual alone cannot tell. Hunger is rarely just about the body. For Mary, it was about fear, defiance, and the fragile reassurance that the world, for a moment, could be held still. Her conflicted hunger sketched a queen caught between devotion and need, exposing a vulnerability no ceremony could disguise. Even so, the tremor beneath these secret meals hinted at deeper tensions stirring within the Tudor court, pressing against the edges of what the crown dared reveal. Deep inside those mounting contradictions, another consuming appetite prepared to step forward. Elizabeth I crafted her public self with a precision that bordered on ritual, understanding that every gesture, every breath, every bite taken before watchful eyes contributed to the mythology she wrapped around her reign. Her meals, like her words, were measured, portions kept small, flavors restrained, indulgence hidden beneath a discipline that suggested sovereignty was an act of endurance rather than appetite. Courtiers admired this restraint, interpreting it as proof of her self-control, her purity, her unshakable command over both body and kingdom. What they did not see, or pretended not to see, were the fractures beneath that polished restraint. Her hunger, unlike her image, was full of contradiction. Elizabeth adored sweets in a way that threatened the tight boundaries she set for herself. Gingerbread in particular held her hostage. Not the humble cakes baked in ordinary kitchens, but rich, spiced loaves carved into shapes, lacquered with honey, or pressed with gold leaf for festival days. She ate them slowly, as though trying to preserve the moment, letting the ginger burn softly along her tongue. These private indulgences rarely exceeded a few bites, but each bite carried an intensity that revealed more than any court proclamation ever could. She was a woman whose discipline cost her something. Yet the real contradictions emerged at night, when the castle quieted and the queen prepared for the weight of what awaited her at dawn. Before speeches, especially the ones meant to sway a divided court or calm a restless nation, Elizabeth often dismissed her attendants, closed her chamber door, and reached for a small box kept hidden among her writing implements. Inside lay honey drops, translucent and golden, the scent faint but unmistakably sweet. She ate them not for pleasure alone, but for steadiness. Honey soothed her throat, sharpened her focus, and, perhaps more importantly, reminded her she was still tethered to something soft before stepping into a world sharpened by politics. Those who glimpsed these moments understood they were seeing something dangerously intimate. A queen permitting herself to feel. The honey drops gleamed in candlelight like secrets, dissolving against her tongue faster than she wished. She chewed them slowly, eyes fixed on nothing, mind tracing the edges of the speech she would give. A speech that might alter alliances, calm rebellion, or ignite new tensions. Each drop was a small promise to herself that she could face the dawn without letting its expectations devour her. Her discipline in public, however, remained absolute. At banquets, she ate lightly, touching only what necessity required. Foreign ambassadors praised her restraint, calling it regal, virginal, evidence of a sovereign whose body remained untouched by excess. They never recognized how much she hid. They never saw the hunger she swallowed quietly when the courses grew too rich, or when the scent of sugared spices rose so heavily from the table that it stirred a longing she refused to reveal. Self-control became both mask and weapon, and like all masks, it grew heavier with time. Elizabeth's relationship with food was neither gluttonous nor starved. It was strategic. She ate to maintain an image, not to satisfy want. She denied herself in daylight to construct a persona so powerful that even her enemies feared her composure. Yet in the solitude of night, when anxiety slipped beneath her door, she reached again for sweetness. Not the riotous hunger of her father, nor the fragile cravings of her brother, but a measured indulgence that revealed her own unique fault line. The contradiction was not hypocrisy. It was survival. A queen who bore the weight of a kingdom, who balanced factions sharper than any blade, who stood alone in a world suspicious of women in power, was permitted few comforts. Sweetness became hers, controlled, hidden, rationed like breath, gingerbread for warmth, honey drops for courage, and beneath the rigid discipline she performed for her court, these small acts carried a tenderness she rarely allowed herself elsewhere. One can imagine her on the eve of a decisive speech, standing near her window, the draught stirring the fringe of her sleeve, a honey drop melting slowly between her teeth. Outside, the kingdom shifted restlessly. Inside, the queen held still, drawing strength from the sweetness she would never admit to craving. The contradiction of it, the Iron Queen and the soft confection, revealed more truth about her reign than any portrait painted in her honor. Her measured indulgence exposed a ruler shaped as much by restraint as by desire, reminding us that even the most disciplined sovereign carries private hungers the crown cannot tame. Even so, the tension between her public composure and private cravings pressed deeper into the heart of Tudor life, hinting at rituals the court preferred to keep unseen. Beneath that, gathering quiet, another truth about royal appetite waited to surface. There were moments in the Tudor courts when power revealed itself not through proclamations or crowns, but through something far quieter. A stain, a smear, a small rebellion etched in the language of appetite. A king or queen might step out of a private chamber with their mantle perfectly arranged, their jewels catching the light, their posture carved into authority. Yet the trained eye of a servant, or the suspicious gaze of a courtier, could sometimes detect a trace of truth lingering in the folds of their clothing, a mark of grease. Faint but undeniable, glistening against fabric meant to symbolize untouchable dignity. Such stains did not belong to the spectacle of the banquet hall. They belonged to stolen minutes behind closed doors, where rulers forgot themselves long enough to indulge in what etiquette forbade. These hidden meals were rarely grand. More often, they unfolded in the hush of a guarded room, where a single piece of meat, a roasted drumstick, a slice torn straight from a joint, became an outlet for emotions that the throne refused to accommodate. Hunger was not the only force guiding those hands. Frustration, loneliness, hunger, exhaustion, each left its own subtle pressure on the bones, its own rhythm in the tear of flesh. In public, rulers were expected to consume food without revealing desire. The court interpreted appetite as weakness, and weakness as a threat. Every gesture was a performance. Even chewing had to appear elegant. But in private, stripped of witnesses, their hands behaved differently. They gripped more tightly. They tore with more force. The bones, once cleaned, often bore the marks of teeth pressed harder than any royal etiquette manual would approve. A half-eaten drumstick, abandoned on a silver plate, became a confession of sorts, a record of agitation, fear, or longing. Servants learned to read these signs the way others read letters or stars. A bone snapped clean through meant anger. A piece, barely touched, meant dread. Grease on the fingertips meant haste. And grease on clothing meant the monarch had forgotten. Truly forgotten. The need to guard their appearance. That forgetfulness was the most revealing of all. A ruler who could not maintain the separation between body and symbol, even for an instant, was a ruler pushed to the limits of endurance. It was not always anger that left these marks. There were nights when the quiet act of eating became a form of self-rescue. A king burdened by council disputes might sit alone with a small roasted joint, letting its warmth spread into the cold places carved by politics. A queen tormented by worry might turn to food not for taste but for grounding, reminding herself that she still existed beyond the expectations piled upon her. In these moments, the act of eating became an anchor, a reminder that beneath the armor of royal duty lived a human being who needed something as simple, as elemental, as the reassurance of a warm mouthful, but solace, when rushed, leaves evidence. A drop of fat slipping onto velvet, a smear hidden in the stitching of a cuff. A faint scent clung to the air long after the meal had ended. These remnants lingered like ghosts, silent testimonies to a struggle the crown could not publicly acknowledge. In courts obsessed with appearances, such stains threatened the entire choreography of power. Rumours could ignite from a single dent in the performance. A rival might interpret a grease mark as decadence, or weakness, or even moral failing. A foreign ambassador might whisper that the monarch had lost control. In this world, the smallest physical trace could be as dangerous as a poorly chosen word. Yet for the monarchs themselves, these marks were strangely liberating. They signalled moments when they allowed the body to eclipse the role, when they chose instinct over performance, satisfaction over ritual. Eating became an act of quiet defiance, not against the kingdom, but against the cage of expectation that ruled them more tightly than any law. A ruler who tore into food with their hands reclaimed, for a brief moment, the right to be simply alive. Something is unsettling in imagining a Tudor sovereign sitting in a shadowed chamber, wiping their mouth with the back of their hand, unaware that a drop of fat has found its way onto a garment crafted to project unshakable authority. Yet that image reveals a truth often hidden behind gilded portraits. Power is not sustained by perfection. but by the tension between the role one performs and the human being who must perform it. A stain on royal clothing is not merely a blemish. It is a crack in the facade, a glimpse of the real person beneath the crown, and perhaps the most honest record of their inner life. In those small, greasy traces, the monarch's carefully crafted image slipped for an instant, exposing a human hunger no ceremony could disguise. Even so, the residue of these secret moments pressed deeper into the shadows of the court, stirring unrest where silence had long been expected. Deep within that uneasy quiet, another revelation of royal appetite began to form. Within the labyrinth of Tudor palaces, where tapestries muffled footsteps and gold-threaded garments cast shimmering reflections along the walls, there existed corners of life far quieter, far humbler, and infinitely more revealing than the banquets that dazzled foreign ambassadors. These corners often smelled not of roasted swan or spiced venison, but of something far more ordinary: warm grain, coarse bread, softened cheese, food so modest they seemed almost invisible amid the machinery of court spectacle. And yet it was precisely these humble dishes that carried truths the monarchy rarely intended to expose. The royal kitchens, vast and disciplined, were designed to feed hundreds. But beside the enormous hearths and towering spits were smaller spaces, narrow passages, alcoves, where cooks prepared bowls of porridge, torn pieces of dark bread, and soft, crumbling cheese made from milk too humble to appear at a feast. These dishes never reached the gilded tables. They were not arranged for a ceremony nor recorded in the scribes' ledgers. They were kept aside, quiet as a held breath, for moments when a ruler could no longer bear the weight of being singular. Porridge, in particular, held a strange intimacy. Thick, steaming, plain in flavour, but steadying in presence. It was the food of childhood, of illness, of ordinary mornings in homes untouched by court intrigue. To sit with a bowl of it, still warm, still fragrant with the faint sweetness of grain, was to momentarily step outside the endless performance of sovereignty. Monarchs, who would never admit fear aloud, found themselves grounding trembling hands against the sides of those warm bowls, letting the heat bleed into their skin like reassurance. Dark bread offered something different: heaviness, a density that promised endurance when fatigue pressed too sharply against the ribs. Rulers tore it by hand, feeling the roughness of its crust, the coarse texture beneath their teeth. In the great hall, such bread was considered beneath their station. Only refined loaves were worthy of royal presence. But behind closed doors, it became an anchor, bread that tasted of earth rather than empire. Then there was cheese, crumbled, sharp, sometimes slightly sour, a food that did not flatter. It lingered on the tongue without ceremony, offering no pageantry, only sustenance. Monarchs reached for it, not out of indulgence, but out of recognition. Real hunger is rarely elegant. The softness of it, the way it pressed lightly against the tongue, often steadied nerves, rattled by council disagreements, court betrayals, or private disappointments. What made these foods especially significant was not their flavour, but the circumstances under which they were eaten. A king, sitting alone with a bowl of porridge, was a man attempting, quietly, to survive the day. A queen tearing pieces of bread in the solitude of an antechamber was a woman easing the tightness around her heart. A ruler leaning over a plate of coarse cheese late at night, long after the court had gone silent, revealed a kind of exhaustion that no heraldic crest could disguise. And yet these dishes did not enter the palace under the guise of indulgence. They often arrived as remedies, disguised as medicinal necessity rather than emotional refuge. A physician might prescribe warm grain as a restorative tonic. A steward might suggest bread as something gentle for the stomach. A servant might bring soft cheese to counter fatigue. These explanations served as protective veils, acceptable reasons to deliver peasant food to royal chambers without raising questions. Everyone understood the unspoken truth. Royalty needed comfort just as desperately as those who worked beneath them. Servants who witnessed these meals treated them with a reverence that bordered on fear. They knew they were seeing a version of the monarch almost no one else ever glimpsed. A sovereign stripped not of power, but of pretense. These moments were fragile, easily broken by a misplaced gaze or a footstep too loud. The ruler's posture softened, their shoulders lowered, their breath steadied. For a handful of minutes, they belonged not to a kingdom, but to themselves. But these quiet acts contained their own risks. To eat like common folk, even in secret, teetered dangerously close to admitting vulnerability. A smear of porridge on a cuff, a breadcrumb caught in a sleeve. Such small traces could, in the right hands, become political weapons. Rivals might whisper that the monarch was weak, ill, even failing. Thus, the secrecy around these meals became almost ritualistic. Doors bolted, curtains drawn, servants dismissed except for the one trusted pair of hands carrying the tray. Still, the need persisted. No crown, no divine right, no carefully cultivated myth could erase the body's need for comfort. Monarchs learned to navigate their cravings as cautiously as they navigated alliances. They rationed simplicity the way they rationed trust. A bowl of porridge could hold more truth than a coronation speech. A crust of dark bread could say more about a ruler's burdens than any proclamation. A piece of crumbling cheese could reveal what no portrait ever dared suggest. Beneath the layers of performance lived a human being trying quietly not to break. In these unadorned meals, the monarchy's facade loosened for an instant, exposing a hunger shaped not by ceremony, but by human need. Even so, the stillness surrounding these peasant dishes stirred whispers deeper within the palace, hinting at indulgences far less innocent than porridge or bread. Deep in that quiet shift, another secret pattern of appetite waited to reveal itself. The Tudor court understood desire as a political force, one that shaped alliances, marriages, and the fates of kingdoms. But the court rarely saw desire in its most revealing form, not in the grand gestures exchanged between monarch and consort, but in the quiet, forbidden moments when a ruler and a lover shared food without witnesses, without ritual, without fear of misinterpretation. These meals were never recorded, never spoken of, never acknowledged. Even in rumour, they took place behind bolted doors, far from the polished etiquette of the great hall, where appetite became intertwined with longing in ways the crown could never afford to display. The food itself was simple, almost brutally so. No gilded platters, no carved swans, no architectural sugar sculptures meant to impress visiting dignitaries. Instead, the dishes brought into those hidden chambers were chosen for their immediacy. Bread that tore easily, meat still warm enough to drip, fruits so ripe they split under the slightest pressure of fingers. The monarch and the lover did not use knives or silver. They used hands. Hands that trembled. Hands that reached without hesitation. Hands that betrayed truths their voices could not. It was eating stripped of performance, strengthened by the urgency of touch. In these rooms, the king did not sit at the head of a table. He sat where he pleased, beside the bed, on a cushioned chair, sometimes even on the floor when exhaustion pressed too heavily against his spine. The lover mirrored his posture, not out of etiquette, but out of intimacy. They often ate from the same plate, passing food back and forth with a familiarity that would have scandalized the kingdom had anyone witnessed it. A piece of torn bread was placed into his hand. A slice of meat was offered halfway, waiting for him to lean forward and take it. The closeness blurred boundaries that the court worked tirelessly to maintain. There was a tenderness in the roughness of these meals, the way fingers brushed against each other, the way breaths mingled when they bent toward the same dish. The way the lover sometimes wiped grease from the corner of the king's mouth, with a touch too gentle to belong in a political world. These small gestures held a weight far greater than the elaborate toasts exchanged during state banquets. They were expressions of trust, or perhaps expressions of need so acute that protocol dissolved under its heat. But tenderness was never the whole story. There was also danger. Always danger. The king's appetite in these encounters was not merely hunger, but a reclamation of self. Eating with a lover allowed him to shed the suffocating shell of monarchy for a few minutes and exist as something closer to human. That freedom, however brief, carried its own dark edge. It made him vulnerable. It made him dependent on secrecy. One misplaced whisper from a servant, one curious eye at the wrong moment, could transform these private meals into political weapons. Rivals could twist the intimacy into weakness, corruption, or moral decay, to minimize risk. The king dismissed all attendants before such meals. The dishes were prepared by a single trusted cook and carried quietly through shadowed corridors. Once the tray crossed the threshold of the chamber, the door shut firmly, sealing the lovers inside a world removed from crowns, councils, and judgment. No one else entered. No one else was permitted to know. Even the remnants of the meal, bones, crumbs, and fruit skins, had to be hidden or destroyed before dawn. A misplaced scrap could unravel everything. It is unsettling to imagine the monarch in such a state. Sleeves rolled up, posture relaxed, hands stained with grease, body leaning toward another in a moment of unguarded want. And yet this was perhaps the truest version of him. A man stripped of the symbolic weight he carried through daylight hours. A man who could, for once, taste without performing. A man who allowed instinct to replace ceremony. The lover, too, occupied a precarious space. Their presence in these meals granted them a form of influence more potent than any official title. The way they fed him, the way they touched his hand, the way they steadied his breath, these actions created a bond the court feared, precisely because it was invisible. Influence earned in the council chamber could be tracked, measured, and counted. Influence earned in the softness of night, through food shared and secrecy maintained, resisted detection entirely. Historians, centuries later, would write about affairs, alliances, scandals, and heirs. They would note the names of mistresses, the political consequences of desire, but none of them could record what truly mattered. The quiet meetings where bread tore, where lovers exchanged glances across candle-lit plates, where appetite softened the sharp edges of power. These scenes survived only in silence, preserved not by ink, but by the absence of it. Meals shared in the king's bedchamber did not build nations or topple courts, but they revealed something just as consequential: the monarch's need to escape the suffocating choreography of royal life. In those rough, intimate meals, the crown loosened, the mask slipped, and hunger, raw, unfiltered, told the story. No historian dared to write. In these forbidden feasts, the monarch's desire exposed truths that no banquet could contain, blurring the line between hunger and longing. Even so, the secrecy surrounding these intimate meals deepened the shadows of the court, stirring unease wherever silence grew too thick to ignore. From within that tightening quiet, another pattern of royal appetite began to sharpen its edges. Hunting pulled the Tudor monarchs out of the suffocating architecture of court life and into a world where power was measured not by ceremony, but by the body, its strength, its breath, its capacity to dominate a landscape unsoftened by stone walls. In the forest, titles slipped into the background, hierarchy blurred. The air itself felt sharper, clearing away the weight of councils and obligations. And when the final arrow flew, or the last cry of the hounds faded into silence, the king stood before the animal he had brought down, meeting a kind of truth the throne never allowed him to face directly. Power could be touched, smelled, tasted. It was after these hunts that the most unrestrained meals unfolded. No long tables, no embroidered linens, no gilded platters. The king ate where he stood, or where he collapsed, breathless and flushed with exertion. A carcass still warm was hauled toward him, its steam mingling with the cold air. Its smell raw, potent, unmistakably alive only moments before. The ritual that followed was primal. Stripped of etiquette, he used a dagger not as a symbol of authority, but as a tool, slicing through hide, carving away flesh, feeling the resistance of muscle beneath the blade. Hands did the rest. They tore meat into ragged pieces, passing it among those present. The king did not wait for a servant or a proper plate. He brought the meat directly to his mouth, teeth sinking in while steam drifted past his lips. Fat dripped freely onto gloves, onto boots, onto the forest floor without a second thought. The forest accepted what the court would have rejected. There was no need to hide appetite here, no need to pretend refinement. Hunger was permitted to reveal its true shape. These meals carried a sense of immediacy that bordered on ritual. Warmth spread through the king's body as he ate, the flavour of blood and smoke intensifying the exhilaration already running hot in his veins. This was a different kind of nourishment, less about sustenance, more about affirmation. The kill proved strength. The feast sealed it. Even courtiers invited to witness these moments felt the shift. They were no longer in the presence of a monarch sculpted by portrait artists. They were standing beside a human animal, formidable and unmasked. What made these meals so revealing was the absence of separation between act and appetite. In the palace, eating required distance from the food, from the hands that prepared it, from the body that consumed it. But here, distance vanished. The king felt the texture of the meat, the heat against his fingers, the trace of iron on his tongue. This tactile immediacy created a connection to the world that court life rarely afforded. It reminded him that before the crown, before the endless machinery of politics, survival had once been simple. Hunt, eat, endure. Servants rarely accompanied these outings, and when they did, they kept an anxious distance. They understood that any sign of hesitation or disgust could be interpreted as disrespect. The king did not need an audience in these moments. He needed freedom. He needed a space where power could be enacted rather than performed. Those who stood nearby remained silent, watching the way his shoulders settled as he ate, the way tension seemed to drain from his jaw, the way satisfaction softened his breath. They understood he was feeding more than hunger. The forest became a sanctuary, precisely because it lacked the palace's eyes. No chroniclers recorded these scenes. No courtiers dared describe them even in private letters. The king's teeth tearing through flesh, the smear of blood across his glove, the brightness in his eyes after eating. These details belonged to a world the monarchy pretended it did not occupy. Official history had no space for rulers who rediscovered themselves through instinct. And yet these were the moments that steadied them, sharpened them, reminded them of a kind of authority untouched by ritual. It is unsettling and strangely moving to imagine a Tudor sovereign seated on a fallen log, dagger in hand, breath rising in pale clouds as he eats directly from the animal he has killed. There is something both vulnerable and fearsome in the image. A ruler reclaiming a part of himself that court life smothered. A man confronting the world without the protective shell of ceremony. A body asserting its strength without apology. For in these wild feasts, the king tasted not just meat, but a fleeting sense of freedom. A freedom unavailable in the palace, where appetite had to be shaped into symbol and performance. Here, Hunger required no explanation. It asked for nothing but honesty. And honesty, in its rawest form, can be far more revealing than grandeur. These ungoverned meals exposed a monarch shaped as much by instinct as by duty, revealing a truth far too coarse for the palace walls. Even so, the pulse of these forest feasts pressed into the court's shadows, unsettling the fragile order that depended on endless restraint. Within that growing disturbance, another facet of royal appetite began to stir. Wine in the Tudor courts was more than a drink. It was a companion to solitude, a solvent for ceremony, a quiet negotiator between the mask of monarchy and the person forced to wear it. Though goblets were raised in public to celebrate alliances or toast victories, the wine that truly mattered rarely touched the light of the great hall. It appeared in small jugs carried through private corridors, poured into cups meant for one pair of eyes only. And it was in these private moments, unwitnessed, unrecorded, that wine revealed the truths the crown strained endlessly to contain. Each monarch developed a preference that reflected something of their inner landscape. Some favoured floral infusions, wine steeped with rose petals or violets, delicate enough to suggest a longing for gentleness in a life carved by duty. Others preferred dark grain spirits, sharp and smoky, the kind that lingered on the tongue with the weight of unresolved decisions. These choices were never accidental. They shaped the atmosphere of private meals, tinting the air with sweetness or bitterness, depending on what the ruler carried within them that night. When the monarch ate alone, an occurrence far more common than official records admit, wine was the one companion permitted to slip past the rigid boundaries of etiquette. Servants poured carefully, ensuring the liquid did not tremble as it met the cup. They stepped back immediately, leaving the sovereign with a silence deep enough for introspection. In such moments, wine softened not only the tension in the muscles, but the sharpness of thought, allowing emotions normally suppressed to drift into the open. Unchallenged, a sip could steady a trembling hand before a difficult letter was signed. Another could blur the memory of a harsh council debate. A third might open a space between dread and action, just wide enough for the monarch to breathe again. Wine loosened the crown without ever removing it. It was during meals that its influence grew strongest. As food warmed the stomach, wine warmed the mind, and together they coaxed hidden truths to the surface. A ruler who drank floral wines often fell into reflective moods, tracing the edges of past choices, wondering how many were made out of fear rather than strategy. One who preferred dark spirits grew quieter, their gaze heavy, their thoughts sharp enough to cut through the practiced stillness they showed their court. The drink shaped not only the body but the tone of the meal, and through that, the tone of the night that followed. In the privacy of the king's or queen's chamber, wine became permission. Permission to speak aloud to no one. Permission to think unguarded thoughts. Permission to surrender, just for an hour, to the gravity of being human. There were nights when the monarch leaned back in a chair, cup tilted loosely between their fingers, eyes fixed on the shimmer of candlelight reflected in the liquid. They drank slowly, as though each swallow peeled back a layer of armor they could not remove by will alone. And there were nights when they drank quicker, almost defiantly, as if daring the drink to soften the locked places inside them. These were the nights when servants found cups left half full or empty beside untouched plates, evidence that the wine had served its purpose, even if the food remained ignored. Hunger, after all, can be silenced, but the need to quiet the mind is harder to deny. Wine also revealed something dangerous: honesty. Beneath its gentle burn, words slipped more easily. Private confessions formed silently in the mind, sometimes even reaching the lips before the drinker caught themselves. A ruler could not afford to be honest. Not with courtiers, not with ambassadors, not even with beloved confidants. But wine dug pathways toward truths they spent their days avoiding. It cracked the veneer of composure with a subtlety no court observer could detect. This was precisely why private wine was handled with such care. Only a handful of servants were permitted to prepare or pour it, and their loyalty had to be unquestionable. A single slip, a spilled cup, a loosened tongue could compromise the fragile boundary between the monarch's public image and private self. The court thrived on stories, and nothing travelled faster than a hint of vulnerability in the sovereign. Yet wine persisted as an essential companion. The crown demanded performance. Wine allowed its wearer to reclaim, however briefly, the truth beneath the role. The drink did not erase burdens. It illuminated them in softer tones, giving the monarch space to sit with their humanity rather than their title. It is easy to imagine a Tudor ruler in such a moment, seated alone before a small table, candlelight wavering, a deep red shimmer swirling beneath the rim of a cup. The air stills. The food cools. The wine warms. And in that fragile balance, the monarch feels more themselves than they ever do beneath the relentless gaze of daylight. In these quiet moments, wine softened the monarchy's rigid edges, revealing glimpses of the person hidden beneath the crown. Even so, the gentle blur of these private drinks deepened the court's silent tensions, hinting at revelations that would cut far sharper than any blade. Out of that gathering stillness, another truth about royal appetite began to take shape. There were moments in the Tudor court when food ceased to be sustenance and became something far more revealing. A quiet confession held between the monarch and the solitude that swallowed them after nightfall. In these hours, the king or queen sat alone before a modest plate or a half-filled cup. No attendants watching. No court expecting a performance. Without witnesses, appetite loosened its grip on restraint, and the ruler slipped into a version of self that daylight never permitted. The crown no longer defined the body. Hunger did. What they chose to eat in these private hours carried meanings no herald ever proclaimed. A piece of roasted meat, still warm, suggested agitation too sharp to hide behind composure. A slice torn instead of cut revealed haste. A need for relief stronger than the desire for elegance. A slow sip of wine, held in the mouth before being swallowed, hinted at reflection, perhaps regret. In solitude, the monarch ate according to emotion rather than expectation, and those emotions left traces more telling than any decree signed at council. It was in these private meals that the king ceased to be an emblem. The royal facade, the carefully disciplined posture, the ritualized gestures, the measured tone, softened into something recognizably human. Shoulders slumped, breathing slowed. A hand lingered on the edge of a cup, longer than necessary, as though the warmth might anchor a thought threatening to drift beyond control. The food before them became a silent companion, absorbing the weight of decisions too heavy to speak aloud. Some nights brought a trembling hunger, sharp enough to drive the monarch toward heavier dishes. Thick cuts of meat, marrow bones split open, fats that clung stubbornly to the fingers. These choices often followed bitter arguments, betrayals whispered through the court's corridors, or hours spent pretending certainty in front of expectant councillors. Eating became a way to reclaim something physical when the world felt unbearably abstract. Each bite grounded the monarch in the simplicity of the body, reminding them they were more than a symbol carved by others. Other nights, appetite disappeared entirely. A single bite of bread sat untouched beside a cooling cup of wine. The ruler stared at the food without lifting it, caught in thoughts too tangled to unravel. In those moments, the plate exposed vulnerability far more honestly than any tremor in the voice. Hunger refused to cross the threshold of the mouth because fear, grief, or exhaustion had taken its place. Such scenes, though invisible to history, revealed the fragility beneath the monarchy's iron frame. The servants entrusted with delivering these private meals recognized their significance, even if they never dared speak of it. They knew that each dish functioned like a window, narrow, fleeting, perilous, into the sovereign's inner state. A return tray containing only bones told a different story from one left nearly untouched. A cup, drained to its final drop, whispered of a restless mind, while a cup abandoned mid-sip suggested a burden too heavy for even wine to soften. These details, though mundane, formed the quiet language of royal truth. The danger of such moments lay in their honesty. For a monarch, honesty was a luxury they could not afford. The court expected a ruler who remained steady regardless of turmoil, whose body never betrayed weakness, whose appetite never flinched. Yet, alone, stripped of audience, the mask fell with a softness that felt almost sacred. They allowed themselves to taste what they genuinely desired, not what the kingdom expected of them. The food, untouched by politics, reflected emotions they concealed everywhere else. In these unguarded meals, the monarch faced the one opponent no counsel could restrain, themselves. A ruler eating alone confronted fears without armor, desires without disguise, and memories without interruption. Sometimes, a soft piece of meat brought back the comfort of childhood. Sometimes, the bitterness of wine stung like the memory of a broken alliance. Sometimes, the simple act of chewing slowed a racing mind enough to keep despair at bay. But this vulnerability, as tender as it was perilous, formed an essential part of sovereignty. A monarch incapable of facing their private truths was ill-equipped to face the pressures of rule. The plate before them, silent, patient, honest, became a mirror far more accurate than any portrait. It reflected not the grandeur imposed upon them, but the beating heart that continued beneath it, quietly insisting on its own needs. It is haunting to picture a Tudor ruler in such stillness, seated at a small table lit by a single candle, a half-eaten piece of meat resting by their hand, a cup of wine warming their palm. The chamber is quiet, except for the soft exhale of breath between sips. In that fragile solitude, the monarch becomes a person again, no less powerful, but far more exposed. Appetite is no longer performance. It is a confession. In these solitary meals, each bite revealed a truth the crown worked tirelessly to bury, exposing emotions that could not survive in daylight. Even so, the weight of these hidden appetites pressed deeper into the court's silent tensions, stirring shadows that slipped into corners where no ritual could reach. Amid that shifting dimness, another unsettling layer of royal hunger began to surface. They whispered about forbidden dishes long before anyone dared to write them down, weaving rumours into the cracks of palace walls where light rarely touched. In the Tudor court, hunger was never a simple matter of eating. It was a stage where desire crossed into danger, where curiosity could taint a king's image, and where a single plate carried the weight of both fascination and fear. Servants learned quickly to avoid asking questions. Courtiers learned even faster that silence was the only currency that kept them alive. The rumours surrounding Henry VIII were the loudest, slipping among the corridors like smoke that refused to fade. Some claimed he once ate horsemeat, an act considered deeply improper, bordering on sacrilege in his world. To eat such meat was to signal desperation or ferocity. Neither image suited the king he wanted to project. Even if the whispers were false, they endured because they fit the man. Restless, unpredictable, hungry in ways that went beyond food. People saw what they wished to believe. And in Henry's case, they believed he would consume anything that promised strength. Oils from distant markets, powders traded in secret, broths that arrived wrapped in foreign cloth. These were said to be stimulants, dishes designed to awaken appetite not just of the body but of desire and domination. They came from places the court considered exotic, dangerous, and thrilling. and because they were foreign, they could be blamed, denied, or praised with equal convenience. Kings used them not simply for pleasure, but for the illusion of power they offered, the idea that something rare could make them more formidable, more virile, more kingly. But these dishes never entered official ledgers. No clerk dared record a plate of spiced meat, rumoured to ignite lust, or a broth said to sharpen aggression, or a candied root believed to stir the blood. The royal household presented purity on parchment, neat lists of venison, swan, quail, and capon, while reality shifted in the shadows behind the kitchens. There, cooks worked quietly, preparing meals the king might deny ever touching if the rumours grew too loud. What made these dishes forbidden was not necessarily their ingredients, but what they represented. A king who indulged in them risked appearing weak to superstition or strong in the wrong direction. These foods were seen as tools, dangerous ones, that could be used to reveal or manipulate desire. If the public believed a king needed such stimulants, then his natural authority appeared compromised. If they believed he relished them, then he risked appearing monstrous. That tension fed the rumour mill. Servants allegedly saw bowls carried into locked rooms late at night. Pages reported smells they could not identify, lingering under doors. A few were said to have witnessed the king tearing into meat that looked darker, richer, and more illicit than anything served in the hall. But these claims dissolved when questioned. Memories blurred. Witnesses became unavailable. Fear had a way of scrubbing stories clean. Still, the idea persisted that forbidden foods revealed a monarch more clearly than any decree or speech. What a king refused. What he craved. What he hid. These details shaped the secret portrait the court painted of him. Behind every rumour was a truth not about the food, but about the man. His insecurities. His appetites. His desires that strained against the rigid expectations of royalty. It was not only Henry. Other Tudor monarchs were whispered to have tasted substances said to calm the mind, stir the blood, or dull sorrow. Even the gentlest rulers were not exempt from speculation. A cup of something bitter at midnight might inspire stories of grief. A plate of something rare might inspire tales of secret vice. These monarchs lived under the gaze of thousands, and any act done behind a closed door became more provocative, precisely because no one could confirm it. The court, in its hunger for intrigue, built entire mythologies from crumbs, a stray scent, a sealed dish, a servant was dismissed too quickly. Each detail fed the belief that beneath the crown was a person ruled not by divine authority, but by appetite, sometimes controlled, sometimes not. What the records omitted, the rumours filled in with unsettling confidence. That was the nature of Tudor secrecy. The more carefully something was hidden, the more vividly people imagined it. These forbidden dishes became symbols of power pursued recklessly, of weakness disguised as indulgence, of desire struggling against the rigid discipline expected of kings. And the court, always watching, learned to read the shift of a monarch's appetite as carefully as they read his laws. The hidden dishes of kings linger like stains on the edge of memory, refusing to vanish no matter how carefully the record keepers scrub them away. The further one peers into these forbidden tastes, the more the line blurs between hunger and something darker. Somewhere in the shadows of the kitchens, the truth waits, with a quiet, unsettling breath. They stood closer to the king than any counsellor, any priest, any lover. The royal cooks moved through the palace like ghosts, quiet, precisi, nearly invisible, yet trusted with the one vulnerability a monarch could never hide: appetite. They knew what soothed him, what angered him, what he demanded on nights when the castle felt too large, and what he refused to admit he craved. While courtiers argued over policies and airs, the cooks listened to a deeper truth, one revealed not in words, but in the simple choosing of a dish. Inside the Tudor kitchens, life never paused. Fires breathed constantly, iron pots hissed, and knives struck wood with rhythmic insistence. These rooms existed far from the throne, yet they pulsed with the heartbeat of power. Here, the king was not a symbol, not a sovereign, but a man with a stomach, a temper, and moments of unbearable loneliness. The cooks learned to read him in the tilt of his requests. A sudden order for heavy meat meant frustration. A quiet demand for broth meant grief. A midnight call for sweet pastries often signaled fear of the coming day. They were never allowed to speak of any of it. Silence was their most valuable ingredient. A royal cook could earn land, a servant's, even gold. But the true currency was secrecy. Every monarch had private hungers, and those hungers became dangerous political knowledge. What a king ate in public expressed strength. What he devoured in private revealed his weaknesses. A cook who observed too much could easily be imagined as a threat. Some disappeared quietly. Some were rewarded excessively, so they would never share what they knew. Some behaved as though their tongues had been removed, even though they remained perfectly intact. They understood that the king's most intimate moments happened with a plate before him. They brought food to him on restless nights, when the corridors were empty and the guards half asleep. They saw the ruler stripped of ceremony, chewing quickly, wiping his mouth with his hand, staring into nothing. They knew when he drank too much, when he lost his appetite entirely, when he demanded the dishes his mother once cooked for him, as though childhood could be summoned back through flavour. A courtier might see the king once a day. A cook saw the truth 3 times daily, sometimes more. The Tudor kitchens kept records, lists of ingredients, schedules of feasts, and expenses for imported spices. But these documents were carefully curated. The real notes never left the cooks' minds. They remembered which nights the king asked for dishes forbidden by physicians, which mornings he was too sick to face the council, which secret ingredients were added to calm his nerves or rouse his blood. They remembered the exact tone of his voice when he summoned them alone. The crown never forgot this power. Many royal cooks were granted far more wealth than their station suggested, not because the monarchy valued cooking, but because it valued silence. To keep them loyal, the court offered houses, land, protection from taxes, and anything to ensure their mouths stayed closed. Others, deemed too observant, too clever, or too dangerous, were let go in ways that left no trace. After a king's death, the kitchens became a battlefield of memory. Some recipes were burned immediately. Some journals vanished. Some cooks were quietly retired, encouraged to settle in distant villages. A few were questioned repeatedly, their stories compared, cross-checked, and scrubbed of anything that might threaten the polished version of the king's legacy. What the monarch had eaten at his lowest moment was as politically sensitive as what he had declared in council. And yet, despite all efforts, a residue of truth lingered. There were whispers about dishes served only on nights of despair, about meats brought to royal chambers when arguments broke into shouting, about flagons of drink prepared, thick with spice, to blunt sorrow. The kitchen walls had absorbed these stories like smoke. They would never speak. But they remembered. Royal cooks lived in a constant dance between service and danger. They touched the king's vulnerability each day, and therefore carried a weight that no noble title could match. They fed him when he was human, not when he was a symbol. They knew that power was not only worn as a crown or spoken through decrees. Sometimes it was held trembling in a hand that reached for food in the dark. To feed a king was to witness the fracture between the royal image and the man behind it. To cook for him was to hold his contradictions. To keep his secrets was to survive. The cooks carried the truth of the monarchy in their quiet hands, guarding every secret that hunger exposed. The closer one looks at their world, the more dangerous their knowledge appears. Behind the drifting kitchen smoke, a deeper story stirs in the shadows. There were moments when the crown felt heavier than the king's own bones. Moments when the palace walls seemed to lean inward, carrying whispers, demand, and expectations that wrapped around him like iron. In those hours, he did not seek counsel or prayer or even companionship. He sought a plate. To eat alone was not a lapse in etiquette. It was a retreat, a silent barricade against the endless machinery of politics that consumed every waking breath. The world believed monarchs held limitless control. Yet solitude at the table revealed the opposite. They were men pressed thin by duty, always watched, always deciphered, until the simple act of chewing in peace became a rare luxury. The court never understood these disappearances. To them, every meal was a stage, every bite performed, every swallow witnessed by nobles eager to interpret meaning where none existed. But the king knew the performance had limits. One could not pretend strength forever. At least, not while trying to digest under the eyes of schemers. So he slipped away to a smaller chamber, a quiet corner of the palace where tapestries muffled sound and no one dared bring parchment or petitions. Here, a humble dish awaited him. Nothing ornate, nothing drenched in symbolism. Just food. Unwatched. Unmeasured. Unjudged. In this secrecy, the king reclaimed what politics had stolen, the right to be unremarkable. A single meal could become a fortress. The room's stillness offered space to breathe without being interpreted. Even the steam rising from warm broth felt like a protective veil, blurring the relentless clarity with which the court examined him. Alone, he could lay down the armor of rulership. His hands, normally so deliberate and disciplined, softened. His shoulders dropped. He chewed slowly, not for flavor, but for silence. This was not indulgence, it was survival. Those closest to the throne understood the implications. When the king vanished into solitude, it signaled exhaustion beyond what diplomacy could fix. The council fretted. Ambassadors waited. Letters piled up. Yet none of them imagined the quiet truth. That the monarch sat in a dim room, staring at a simple bowl of food as though it were the last safe place in the kingdom. No ritual, no choix, no grand table, just the faint crackle of the hearth and the weight of his own thoughts. To eat alone was an act of rebellion. Not rebellion against policy, but against the suffocation of expectation, against the endless performance of certainty, against the idea that a king must always be a king. By choosing solitude, he reclaimed a measure of humanity that the throne constantly eroded. He could refuse the feast prepared for spectacle. He could refuse to let ministers read meaning into every choice of meat or sauce. He could refuse to be consumed by the roles others forced upon him. A spoonful of stew held more freedom than any edict he signed. Sometimes these solitary meals stretched into hours. The food cooled while he lingered in thought, running a thumb along the rim of the bowl as though grounding himself in something real. Other times, he devoured the food quickly. Sharp, decisive bites, because the urgency to escape the court's pressure overwhelmed him. The palace might have been vast, but true freedom existed only in the few feet around a private table. The servants, trained to read the palace's moods better than any advisor, stepped lightly on these nights. They delivered the food without comment, avoiding eye contact, then disappeared like smoke. They understood that solitude was both shield and confession. Some kings asked for familiar dishes from their youth, others demanded nothing more than bread and cheese. One monarch favoured thin porridge during political crises. It soothed him more than strategy ever could. Another preferred roasted meat, tearing it apart with his hands as though reclaiming something primal erased by royal constraint. These meals became diaries written in crumbs. In them lay the truth of kingship, not triumphs or decrees, but exhaustion doubt, longing. A man seated at a table with no witnesses revealed more than any grand proclamation in the great hall. Within each quiet mouthful was an unspoken admission that the throne demanded too much, that the court's noise drowned out the simple rhythms of being alive. Eating became a temporary erasure of the crown, a soft rebellion cloaked so beautifully in simplicity that no minister could accuse him of treason. No guards questioned the king's absence from the banquet. No nobles dared ask why their ruler had stepped away from the ceremony. Public meals were rituals of stability. Private meals were rituals of survival. And every ruler, no matter how powerful, I needed a place to breathe where politics could not reach. When he finally returned to the palace corridors, face composed, crown steady, voice sharpened, the council believed he had been praying, or drafting letters, or attending to secret matters of state. None guessed that he had been sitting quietly, letting broth warm his hands, while the storm inside him calmed. The table had steadied him better than any advisor could. A quiet meal could steady a ruler in ways the council never understood. What happened in those hidden moments carried more weight than any public feast. Behind that silence lies another truth waiting to come to light. A king did not often confess his loneliness, but his cravings betrayed him with remarkable honesty. When the court grew suffocating, and the crown felt more like a weight than a symbol, he asked for dishes that carried the scent of gentler years. Meals that had nothing to do with status, diplomacy, or ritual. These foods slipped beneath the armor he wore for the world, reaching a part of him untouched by politics. A bowl of something soft, sweet, or simply familiar could transport him to a time when life unfolded without scrutiny. Before duty hardened his shoulders, and silence became his preferred companion. In these private requests, the court glimpsed nothing. They did not know why the king ignored extravagant feasts to summon a humble childhood dish to his chamber. They did not question why he waited until twilight, when torches flickered, and servants moved quietly along the walls. The act was not about hunger. It was about recovering a self buried beneath years of rule. Childhood flavors worked like keys, unlocking rooms within him that adulthood had sealed away. The royal kitchens respected these moments more deeply than any ceremonial banquet. Cooks moved with unusual tenderness when preparing a dish that had once been touched by a mother's hand. They stirred slowly, measured carefully, and brought the bowl to the king with silent understanding. No trumpets, no procession, just a plate resting gently before a man who had not been allowed to feel young for far too long. He did not eat these meals quickly. He held them first, letting the warmth seep into his palms, letting the aroma whisper of mornings without court politics or battles waiting on the horizon. With the first bite, something within him softened. A tension he did not realize he carried loosened just enough to breathe. Food meant for a child had become a refuge for a ruler. Some kings preferred simple porridges, sweetened with a touch of honey. Others reached for spiced puddings, remembered from winter kitchens. One monarch found comfort in stewed pears, prepared exactly as his mother had made them to ease childhood fears. Another asked for oat gruel during the darkest nights of political turmoil, claiming it quieted his mind when no advisor could. These dishes were not symbols of luxury. They were symbols of safety. At times, he would eat alone in near darkness, the flickering light of a single candle casting faint golden shapes across the room. At other times, he let the bowl sit untouched for minutes, savouring memory more than flavour. Tears rarely fell, but they hovered under his composure, private, dignified, allowed only here, in this small chamber where no minister could interpret them as weakness. To the council, the king appeared refreshed after these solitary meals, though they never knew why. They assumed he had prayed or meditated or studied diplomatic papers. None of them imagined he had simply eaten something that reminded him of being held, being loved, being unburdened by consequence. Food from childhood did not change policy or strengthen armies. Yet it steadied the man who carried both burdens. It reminded him that he had been someone before he became a title. And on the hardest days, that reminder kept him from collapsing beneath the demands of the throne. The power of these meals lay in their intimacy. They belonged to no one but him. Not to the realm. Not to the court. Not even to the lineage whose name he bore. They were fragments of a life untouched by crowns, stored inside him like embers that refused to die. Each bite fed more than the body. It fed the memory of innocence. These dishes were the only moments in which the king allowed himself to be small again. He never spoke of these meals publicly. Servants who witnessed them said nothing. Cooks understood that the recipes were not to be recorded in official documents. If the court had discovered how deeply a bowl of soft pudding could steady the king's spirit, they might have tried to control it, manipulate it, weaponize it, so the secret remained safe, tucked in the space between hunger and longing. In truth, these meals were not escapes, they were reminders. The king returned to his duties afterward with clearer breath, shoulders straightened, and his public mask restored. Memory had fed him just enough to continue bearing the crown he could never remove. These gentle dishes softened the weight of kingship in ways no council could understand. Their quiet power lingered long after the bowl was emptied. In the sweetness of memory, another hidden truth begins to rise. Not every fear entered the king's life with the sound of marching armies or the clash of steel. Some slipped in quietly the moment a plate touched the table. A war, with all its chaos, at least offered clarity. He knew who wanted him dead, who stood beside him, and where the danger lay. But dinner carried its own battleground, one lined with porcelain instead of shields, where loyalties blurred, and memories struck harder than arrows. A simple dish, a familiar scent, or a single presence across the table could unravel his composure far more deeply than any campaign fought on distant soil. Meals had long shadows in the Tudor court. Certain foods stirred memories he fought to bury, failures no one else dared mention, betrayals recorded only in the silence of his mind. A particular roast might recall a negotiation that collapsed disastrously. A fish dish might pull him back to a night when losses piled faster than his scribes could record them. Sweet pastries could resurrect moments when grief hollowed him so thoroughly he could hardly lift a spoon. Eating was never neutral. Every flavor risked becoming a reminder of what he wished history would forget. He sometimes ordered entire platters removed untouched. The servants believed he had lost his appetite. The truth was sharper. Some dishes carried the weight of ghosts, and he knew too well how memory could choke harder than poison. Cooks, unaware of the emotional terrain they navigated, prepared meals with dutiful precision, never guessing that a particular spice or texture could collapse the king's self-control. Then came the fear no monarch could admit aloud. The fear of sharing a table with someone who might be plotting his downfall. The court was a forest of smiling predators. To dine beside a suspected traitor required a performance more disciplined than any military maneuver. Every glance, every lifted cup, every pause in conversation carried meaning. The king monitored their hands, their posture, the tilt of their spoons, and the calmness of their chewing. If trust wavered, the meal became unbearable. Wine burned sharper. The meat turned heavy. Even silence tasted threatening. A spoon, in these moments, felt heavier than a sword. While poison was rare, the possibility haunted every banquet. The king relied on tasters, rituals, and watchful servants. But no system erased the deeper fear that someone who bowed respectfully before him might be calculating the right moment to end his bloodline. A battlefield declared its dangers openly. A dining table hid them behind ceremony. Even at grand feasts, he sensed danger pulsing beneath the music and laughter. Plates slid before him with perfectly arranged meats, but his eyes kept drifting to the hands that served them. Cups brimmed with wine, Yet he tasted the room more than the drink. Every motion around him felt sharpened. Too smooth. Too deliberate. He trained himself to eat without hesitation. To conceal suspicion. To swallow fear before swallowing food. Public meals demanded strength he did not always possess. Then there were the private terrors. Those born not of betrayal, but of emotion. Some dishes reminded him of loved ones lost, or victories hollowed by cost, or nights when he doubted his own rule. These private fears could not be battled. They seeped into him quietly, stirred by scents and textures that stirred the past. The stronger the memory, the slower he ate, sometimes pausing long enough that the food cooled entirely. But he could never show this vulnerability. If a king refused a dish associated with a past failure, the court would whisper that he was unraveling. If he avoided eating beside someone he feared, nobles would gossip about instability. Every hesitation became political currency. Thus, he learned to lift each fork with unwavering calm, to smile even when tension coiled beneath his ribs, to drink with steady hands despite the cold suspicion that travelled his spine. The table became a stage more dangerous than the battlefield. He mastered the art of controlled chewing, controlled breathing, and controlled glancing. No warrior's discipline matched the composure required to dine while surrounded by those who wanted something from him. Allegiance, influence, or silence. Food, once a simple necessity, transformed into an exercise of strategy. He survived meals not by appetite, but by vigilance. Yet behind the polished surface, he remained painfully human. A king could ride into war without dread, could sign executions without trembling, could deliver speeches without faltering. But a dinner seasoned with memory, tension, or suspicion could shake him. War threatened the kingdom. Dinner threatened the man. Some dishes carried wounds no armor could block. Even the smallest flavor could reveal how fragile a ruler truly was. Beneath that delicate tension, another hidden truth begins to gather its shape. Long after the kings were gone, after their feasts, their indulgences, their private midnight hungers, something of them still clung to the royal kitchens. Power faded, crowns changed hands, and dynasties shifted like tides. Yet the rooms where monarchs once fed their desires refused to forget. The palace could repaint walls and polish silver until it gleamed like new. But the kitchens remained stubborn archives of the truth. They carried memories not written in chronicles or preserved in state documents, but scorched into brick, soaked into wood, hidden in the cramped spaces where heat, secrecy, and appetite once mingled in the same breath. Recipes outlived kings. Some royal cooks, bound by duty and tradition, passed their knowledge quietly to younger apprentices. Not the ceremonial dishes. Those had official records and public instructions. But the private ones. The ones the king asked for on nights when exhaustion hollowed him. The ones he demanded during scandals. The court pretended not to see. The ones he ate quickly, almost angrily, when the weight of the rule felt unbearable. These recipes were never written down in clean script. They survived the way confessions do. Whispered. Imperfect. Kept alive through memory. Thus, even centuries later, fragments persisted. A handful of spices stored exactly as they once were. An odd method of cutting meat that no modern cook could explain. A peculiar combination of herbs so tied to one monarch's anxiety that no cook dared erase it from tradition. These small inheritances might seem insignificant, but in the Tudor kitchens, they were relics. Quiet testimonies of secret appetites kept away from thrones and courtiers. More visible traces existed, too, though few recognized them. The floors bore marks from pots heated too long, while the king argued with ministers nearby. Sooty shadows lingered on ceiling beams, where oil spat from forbidden dishes cooked in haste. Some bricks, when touched, still held the faint texture of scorch marks left by a dish prepared only for the king's darkest nights. The palace tried endlessly to repair these imperfections. Yet they reappeared like stubborn memories, refusing to be smoothed away. Even the walls carried stories. Grease seeped into the wooden panels over decades, sinking deep into the grain, no matter how often the rooms were scrubbed. A faint smell, fatty, smoky, strangely intimate, clung to the air. It was not unpleasant, only persistent. A reminder that behind the glittering facade of royal life stood kitchens that worked relentlessly to feed not just the king's body, but his moods, fears, cravings, and fragile humanity. The scent was history that refused to leave. Servants spoke of moments when the aroma seemed strongest, during storms, when humidity awakened old residue, on winter nights, when fires were stoked high, or when a new king walked the palace halls for the first time. And the rooms stirred as if remembering another ruler's footsteps. Kitchens are sensitive listeners. They remember heat, footsteps, arguments, and laughter. They remember the clatter of forbidden meals sliding onto plates at midnight. They remember the trembling hands of cooks delivering food meant to soothe or strengthen. Or silence. Some rooms held even darker traces. In narrow cupboards, forgotten tools rusted beside strange containers whose contents were long since lost. Some believed these belonged to cooks who prepared dishes the court tried to erase. Meals linked to scandal, illness, or nights when the king's desires betrayed his carefully crafted image. Other relics hinted at the presence of tasters, men who risked death each day so the monarch might swallow without fear. Their bowls and spoons remained tucked away like artifacts of quiet sacrifice. The palace archivists rarely catalogued anything from the kitchens. They preferred documents filled with triumphs and treaties. Yet the truth of the monarchy lived just as strongly in these stubborn stains. These lingering smells. These recipes carried like secrets. While the throne room displayed power, the kitchen stored vulnerability. Everything the king never wanted written. Everything he consumed to survive another day, wearing a crown. Visitors centuries later sometimes reported odd sensations in these rooms. A strange heaviness in the air, the faint echo of utensils striking wood, a scent both warm and distant, as though someone had cooked a meal meant for comfort rather than display. Historians dismissed these impressions as imagination, but cooks knew better. Kitchens are built of memory as much as stone. They do not forget those who shaped them. What remained in the Tudor kitchens was not grandeur. It was residue. Emotional. Physical. Invisible, yet undeniable. Power may crumble, but hunger leaves marks that outlast reigns. The kings themselves became dust. But the spaces where they revealed their truest selves endured. Places where secrets simmered, where desires softened the edges of authority, where the reality of being human stained the walls far more deeply than ceremony ever could. Old kitchens hold stories that official history refuses to record. Their lingering traces reveal more about kings than any polished chronicle. From those quiet remnants rises a final truth, waiting just beyond the doorway. History likes to dress itself in glory. Battles, treaties, and coronations, all arranged neatly, like jewels in a royal crown. But beneath that polished surface lies a truth far messier. Warm with breath, sticky with grease, heavy with the smells of kitchens and the shadows of private hunger. The story of kings is not only forged in war rooms or council halls, it is also etched into plates, scraped clean in the dark. Cups drained when no ambassador was watching, and crumbs scattered on tables where a monarch allowed himself to be merely human. Power may speak through decrees, but it whispers through appetite. In every Tudor reign, food mirrored the shifting landscape of authority. A public feast was never simply a meal, it was architecture. It arranged bodies, established hierarchies, and choreographed obedience. The placement of dishes conveyed wealth. The number of courses demonstrated has been reached. The spices revealed connections that stretched far beyond the English Channel. Even the way a king touched his napkin could signal political intention. To eat in public was to perform power with the precision of a staged ritual. But what lived under the table told a different story. In the shadows where candles trembled, the monarchy exposed itself far more honestly. A king, tearing into a roast with his hands, spoke more truth about his nature than any speech delivered from a throne. The dishes he requested at midnight told more about his fears than the proclamations he signed at dawn. His cravings betrayed him, revealing wounds he hid from courtiers, anxieties he buried beneath ceremony, and desires he could not tame with discipline or prayer. The private meal was the real document of kingship. Some rulers sought solace in dishes remembered from their childhood, soft flavors that drew them back to a time untouched by governance. Others devoured heavy meats, as though consuming something dense enough to weigh down the chaos inside their minds. A few turned to wine, dark, fragrant, burning with reassurance, to soften the sharpness of decisions they carried alone. And some kings, in moments of desperation, ate in secrecy, not out of hunger, but out of rebellion, asserting control in the only space where no one could interpret their choices. For kings lived lives of constant observation. Every expression was read, every gesture was dissected, every bite, every sip, every refusal carried meaning. Political factions tracked the dishes the king touched, the ones he avoided, and the ones that returned to his table again and again. Yet none of them could see what happened in the quiet chambers, where the monarch removed the armor of leadership and consumed his regrets one mouthful at a time. Some meals defined reigns far more profoundly than battles. A king refusing a dish associated with defeat. A ruler choosing to dine alone rather than face a court swirling with conspiracy. A monarch demanding food forbidden by physicians because the taste gave him the illusion. Brief, intoxicating, of mastery over a body that betrayed him daily. Food became the kingdom's most intimate archive. The kitchens stored the residue of longing, bitterness, desire, and exhaustion more truthfully than any official manuscript. Their walls held the scent of nights when kings surrendered to instinct rather than decorum. Their floors bore the marks of hurried preparations for meals never meant to be remembered. Their utensils carried the quiet weight of secrets exchanged only through taste. To understand a Tudor king, one must look beyond the throne and into the firelit corners, where pans hissed and ladles stirred. It is impossible to ignore how often rulers relied on meals to reclaim a sense of control. When politics constricted them, they ate alone. When grief hollowed them, they reached for sweetness. When fury burned, they demanded spices fierce enough to match the heat of their rage. The body does not lie. Appetite reveals the truths that crowns conceal. And in the end, kings were not defined solely by the wars they fought, the heirs they produced, or the alliances they forged. They were shaped by the private rituals that sustained them. A midnight slice of salted pork, a cup of mulled wine, trembling slightly in tired hands, a piece of gingerbread bitten before a speech that would decide the fate of a kingdom. These moments did not make it into official portraits, but they sculpted the men those portraits tried to idealize. Under the layers of velvet, authority and performance lived something profoundly human, the need to eat, to find comfort, to escape, even briefly, the weight of sovereignty. And so, history must acknowledge that power is not only written in ink and blood, but in mervaru, fat and wine, the hidden currencies of emotional survival. For every act of public might, there existed a private hunger. For every triumph, a quiet fear tasted late at night. For every polished banquet, an unspoken truthis concealed in the grease of a secret dish. Perhaps this is the most honest legacy the Tudor kings left behind. Not the battles carved into stone or the decrees preserved in archives, but the lingering scent of meals that once soothed, steadied, or exposed them. The soft reminder that beneath the crown sat a man who reached for food as a child might reach for the warmth of a parent's hand. Power may outlive the powerful, but appetite outlives both. It is in this tension between authority and hunger that the real monarchy is found, not in the golden throne room, but in the chambers where kings swallowed doubt, desire, and memory along with their meals. The grease left behind, the wine stains that never fully faded, the recipes whispered rather than written. These are the fingerprints of rulers far more than the statues built in their honor. History remembers war, but kitchens remember truth. And in that truth, the monarchy becomes less mythic and more human. Flawed, vulnerably, desperately hungry in ways no coronation could disguise. Thank you for staying with this story until the final breath of the final meal. As the fires of the Tudor kitchens grow dim and the echoes of knives and spoons settle into silence, may your night soften around you like warm candlelight. Sleep peacefully, knowing that even kings sought small comforts in the dark. May you find yours as well.